So we'll begin today with a lecture by Vanden Broecke, who is professor at Ghent University and has written various papers and books on, well, astrology, but history as well, but the nature of astrology and the discussion on how astrology engages thought, culture, and philosophy, among other things. So, please, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. When Luis invited me to participate in a conference focusing on the historical study of astrological techniques, or more succinctly, astrological practices, it was easy for me to accept. Although I have to say that I wasn't sure to what extent the reasons for my accepting would be what Luis had in mind. Because my enthusiasm stems from the interesting issues raised by the concept of astrological practice itself, I suppose. Yesterday, however, I was reassured in a way because I feel like I may not be the only one interested in such things. I refer, for instance, to Dorian's important paper on the divinatory genealogy, perhaps, of astrological practice, or some astrological practice, on the one hand. I also refer to the important things that Laszlo treated us to in terms of the rhetoric and the narrative construction that is going on in astrology, and I think my paper is roughly trying to tread similar terrain, but differently, as I will try to explain now. So, as far as I can tell, for the most part, historians of astrology have had relatively little interest in querying the concept of an astrological practice. A few recent and not so recent pointers. Darrell Rudkin's project of salvaging the history of astrology from its pre-paradigmatic slumber, for instance, rests largely on a priori distinction between, on the one hand, what he calls a practical astrology, which is about making horoscopes, and on the other hand, the theory of, as he explains it, scientific foundations in mathematics, natural philosophy, and medicine. Now, other historians have tried to historicize this distinction. For instance, Bob Westman's famous or infamous, depending on where you're coming from, book does a lot of work amongst many other books in historicizing the very concept of theoria and practica as applied to the science of the stars. Now, the net effect is that in the past years, astrological practice has certainly come to the fore, has come center stage as a category of analysis. Westman, for instance, warmly invites us to approach the astrologer as, I quote him here, a practitioner engaged in specialized disciplinary practices, end of quote, and to relativize the connection to theory that was central to the history of astrology for a long time. Despite these differences of opinion about practice as a historical category of analysis, however, the historians do agree, or these historians do agree, that to engage in an astrological practice is to make predictions for specific times and places. I took the easiest summary that I could find. In other words, an astrological practice is roughly defined by the twin moments of, on one end, collecting chronological and astronomical data, and on the other end, issuing an interpretation. And one important background engine for this definition, it seems to me, is the assumption that astrology is a pre-modern analog to modern forecasting techniques. It produces knowledge, we often read, through which past actors sought to sedate fear and avoid material loss. As we've already seen yesterday, there are very interesting alternative opinions and alternative options. And I do refer to Dorian here, for instance, who's whose talk, to me at least, well, Geoffrey Cornelius's work was explicitly referenced here yesterday, who operates and spoke to us from within a very interesting tradition that is sought to explore the divinatory components of astrology. Cornelius's work is a very important reference here. To me, the book that Patrick Curry and Roy Willis did about 20 years ago, I suspect, is an important reference, as is the 2010 volume on divination that Patrick Curry authored and which you see on the bottom right-hand side. I am sure that I won't do justice to this approach in what I wrote on this slide, but I'll do it anyway. Especially when you listen to Patrick Curry, the idea is that astrological practice stems from what he calls somewhere, I think in the Roy Willis book, an irreducible experience of direct interconnectedness between the visible heavens and the terrestrial realm, and that this gives rise or is at the origins of a divinatory life form, as it is often called, felicitously, I think, which is in a relation of tension with the rationalizing life forms of modernity. So also Max Weber's notions of disenchantment are never very far away in the background here. So this connects the issue of astrological practice. What are we talking about? The concept to a whole series of interesting historiographic questions, I think. On the one hand, you have historians who tend to reify astrology into an essentially pre-modern thing. I don't think it's entirely contingent that most of the research on history of astrology is done on ancient and medieval sources, which is actually really strange when you come to think of it, given that most historians of science work on 19th and 20th century things. On the other hand, you have the divinatory approach, which I sometimes feel uneasy with because it tends to have a sort of background message of astrology as an anti-modern, or at least an a-modern phenomenon. Whichever option you take, you seem to reach a point where astrology is inevitably elsewhere, whether chronologically or spatially, culturally. And this is, I'm just laying this out to explain some of my background concerns here, which lead me to do what I'm trying to do today. So what is it that I would like to do today? I'd like to see if there are historical reasons for taking a distance from a definition of astrological practice in terms of making predictions for specific times and places, and for defining astrological practice between those two moments of collecting data on the one hand and issuing an interpretation on the other hand. I'll try to do it historically, in a very humble and easy way, I believe. By simply asking myself the question, especially myself, what did late medieval Western court practitioners say and perhaps also think they were doing in the first place when they engaged in astrological practice? My background question is how do their actors' definitions of astrological practice relate to changing frames of reference, which is where the political dimension comes in, I think. All of this resonates with some of the extremely important work done by other people in this room, for instance, Jean-Patrice Boudet, and I'm hoping to add something of interest to it today. So, first of all, can we distance astrological practice from astrological technique? That's another way of phrasing what it is I'm interested in today. And in order to explore that option, I would like to take my cue from a book which I was asked to review about 2 years ago, I think, which came out from a very young historian, Alexander Boxer. It's a very interesting book, I think, which takes a long-term approach to astrology. So it's called A Scheme of Heaven. It's a trade book. And in one of the chapters, essentially the chapter devoted to to the Western Middle Ages, Boxer takes Guido Bonati, which I'm sure that many of you know, as his main example. And what Boxer does, his overall argument is that astrology is the predecessor of modern big data science. That's Boxer's overall argument. He comes from the world of big data science, so not surprising. And his argument is that he enlists Guido Bonati to argue that medieval astrological practice offered precise algorithms, these are the expressions that Boxer uses, for addressing any possible risk or uncertainty. And the algorithms in question, as you know more than anyone, were known very often as elections, determining a suitable time for an action, and interrogations, determining the outcome of an uncertain situation. And we've heard a lot on those two practices yesterday. As was also pointed out yesterday, elections and interrogations were very often the bread and butter of working astrologers in the medieval and early modern period, and Bonati was a major reference for that. But what did Bonati think he was doing? That's what I'm interested in when he was casting elections. Well, when we go back to his Tractatus Astronomiae, Treatise 7, which is where the interesting bits are for this particular question, what did Bonati think he was doing when he was casting elections? We get the following answer. Election, this is my translation, election, Bonati writes, is counsel for the appetite of the client. For choosing is an intellectual appetite that stems from an act of free will. Through elections, we can apprehend many good things and similarly avoid many evils that will come from the stars. I do not claim that an election makes a thing, but it removes it and stops it from happening. If by astrology victory was predicted for someone who is to ride out against an enemy, he could still succumb from an evil beginning of his journey, or at least diminish much of the good signified in the judgment, unless the querent had a good election when moving his army against an enemy. End of quote. Bonati's characterization of what was supposedly one of the most utilitarian, risk-savvy astrological practices of all was a bit of a surprise to me, I suppose, for two reasons. First of all, astrological election is described here as a practice of governing human appetite, in this case, intellectual appetite or volition. And secondly, Bonati is rather emphatic, I think, that his practice is not productive, or at least not in the sense that we would usually give to this. It does not bring something new into being, but it removes impediments for beneficial gifts from the stars, for instance, victory in war. Summarizing, for Bonati, astrology seems to be a practice for aligning human desire and volition, on the one hand, with a history produced by the stars. And in wielding this interpretation, he invites us to stretch our definition of astrological practice beyond the strict boundaries of technical procedure that I sketched out a little while ago. So, in Bonati's description, the magic circle, if we may call it that, of the astrologer's horoscope casting also includes the upstream phenomena of human desire and volition, and the downstream effect of negotiating a history into which one is born. And one may wonder if this does not put us squarely onto the terrain of praxis. Astrological practice is then styled as an art of perfecting human action and conduct, and not as a mere technical art of producing knowledge about the future. It occupies terrain also inhabited by political government of others and moral self-government. Small wonder, perhaps, that judgment was a preferred actus category for an astrological prediction in this period. Bonati gives us an initial lead for overcoming the modern disjunction of social practice and productive technique by associating astrology with the art of governing moral conduct, and hence with the world of praxis. 2 centuries later, we find this interpretation alive and well in the Astrological Veritate of the Sienese astrologer Lucio Belante, who extensively discussed the question whether astrology is theoretical or practical in the opening articles of his De Astrologica Veritate. It's rather interesting to follow Belante's argument, I think. Belante initially considers the first option, astrology as a theoretical science, on the basis of an argument which I will recite here, open quote, "A science is practical if its end is an extrinsic operation, which does not remain but is transient. The end of astrology is not some extrinsic operation, but only knowledge of the future. Hence, astrology is a speculative or theoretical science, not a practical one." However, Belante eventually determines the question in favor of the opposing position that astrology is wholly practical, like medicine, even if certain parts of it were called theoretical, as you all know. And his argument was that astrology aims for a transient operation, not speculation. In a general sense, Belante argued all sciences of men could be called practical in as far as they pursue a specific result. Interestingly, Belante's preferred examples of such results, happiness, something opportune, good works, moral virtue, very often largely came from the realm of the praxis of ethics. In the most proper sense, Belante continued, astrology was practical because it, open quote, teaches the manner of operating by which we can increase good things and diminish evil ones, in according with Ptolemy's opinion in Gentiloquium 5. I'm sure you all know this reference, end of quote. And here, Belante's comparisons were with 3 other disciplines, medicine, the military art, and, interestingly, moral theology. So, Belante explicitly did not identify astrological practice with techniques for producing predictions. As in the case of Bonati 2 centuries earlier, perhaps, he advances a more encompassing view, where astrological practice is defined in terms of rendering human conduct more rational. Belante tended to locate astrology in the world of praxis and practical reasoning, where well-ordered human action through the cultivation of prudence perhaps was key, or so I would like to develop in the rest of this talk. It remains to be seen, however, why such late medieval astrologers presented their art as one that aims to perfect human action. And secondly, how astrology was assumed to do this in the first place. In practice, if you like, pun intended. In order to shed more light on this, I would now like to focus on Konrad Heingarter, a Franco-Swiss astrologer working at the Bourbon court in the second half of the 15th century, who was of special interest to the late Helena Avelar, which is the reason why I chose to focus on Heingarter today. Despite being one of the most well-documented late medieval astrologers, Heingarter remains relatively unknown, and I've had the opportunity to look closer at his extant manuscript materials in the past year. So I'm going to try and tease some things out of that which are relevant to my approach. Concerning the why, so why do astrologers like Belante, like Bonati, ally the art with the world of praxis rather than the simple techne of producing knowledge? Well, part of my argument is that late medieval astrology offers an interesting case, if you like, of the appropriation of theological languages of government, divine government, in a context of newly emerging political frames of reference. That's something which really interests me. And this is what I would like to unpack a little bit, first of all. On the 15th of February 1469, Heingarter finished a very well-known, or, well, not very, but relatively well-known, extensive judgment on the nativity of his friend Jean de la Goutte, financial governor-general to Duke Jean II of Bourbon, from the Moulins court in central France. Heingarter's judgment comprised both an analysis of de la Gout's birth chart and a tabulated inventory of fatidic astrological times for de la Gout's consideration. Sometime after 1469, Heingarter complemented his judgment with an even more extensive personalized medico-astrological regimen, comparable to the ones he composed for the Duke and the Duchess in 1477 and 1480, respectively. Heingarter's astrological regimen for de la Goutte began with the following observation. The course of the condition of human life is alternatingly executed by a sharp or a tranquil motion. For the course of the celestial stars, the dispenser of our entire life, by which the entire virtue of this microcosm is governed, will guide the steering oar. End of quote. Governing was one of Heingarter's favorite terms to characterize the stars' manner of relating to sublunary bodies. We find it all over the place. Moreover, when Heingarter wrote de la Goute's Nativity, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles was among his resources for conceptualizing astral fate. And as is well known, Book 3 of Summa Contra Gentiles offered an authoritative analysis of God's providence and government over creatures. And governing, Aquinas explained, is nothing else than directing the governed towards an end that is some good. So, in the background here is the idea that the stars are to be interpreted as key agents and to be approached as key agents of the providential government of creatures towards their appointed end. Astrological knowledge primarily offers such narratives of sublunary government. These narratives of government also authorized practices of self-government. Indeed, governing oneself, regere sibi, and the cognate substantive regimen were Heingarter's preferred terms to describe the practices through which one negotiated the permanent conduct of sublunary bodies by celestial influence. Heingarter's use of regimen probably drew on the language of medical advice literature after the 14th century, but the word, as other historians have pointed out, also carried a much broader range of soteriological, political, and ethical meanings, whose semantic core referred to the practice of governing self and others towards a given end. Late medieval astrological discourse differentiated itself from its theological template, however, by centralizing fortune as the practical end of self-government. This did not come from out of nowhere. A small survey will show that in Herman of Carinthia's translation of the Introductorium Maius, for instance, Abu Mashar already qualifies neglect of astrological knowledge as, I quote, exposing oneself equally to all events of fortune. Bonati's Tractatus claimed that fortune dominates in all things. There's also the translated Epistola de Rebus Eclipsium of Mashallah, which warns its Latin readers that, I quote, fortune and misfortune happen irrespective of the judgment and will of those who suffer it, and are the work of the planets under God's command. These passages show that divine governance remains in the background of astrology's professed focus on fortune. Once again, it turns out that Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles plays a major role in theorizing this connection. It has been noted, for instance, that 2 Aristotelian definitions of fortune were available in scholastic thought. On the one hand, fortune as an accidental cause of events. On the other hand, fortune as a natural or divine impulse towards unexpected outcomes. And several scholars, most recently Valéry Cordonnier, have noted that Summa Contra Gentiles played an important role in promoting the latter definition, which approached fortune as Vincenzo Ciofari has put it, the impetus at the proper time to do that which is advantageous without knowing the reason why. Interestingly, it was Summa Contra Gentiles 392 which adopted this notion of fortune to describe how God, angels, and the stars surreptitiously direct humans in 2 respects: towards certain actions or towards success in accomplishing these actions. And when you track it further, you can see that late medieval astrological discourse often embraces precisely this account of fortune. Now, this conceptual change helped buttress astrology's credibility as an articulation of heavenly government. But fortune, of course, also evokes spaces of freedom inside such government, and thus the possibility of self-conduct. If astrological knowledge narrates the ineluctable cosmic rhythms of sublunary bodies, fortune punctuates moments of tension between passion and action, or between fate and freedom inside this rhythm. Playing on the metaphor of governing, gubernatio, Heingarter's regimen for de la Goutte reused an ancient sailing metaphor to evoke this tension. I quote, "You must not wonder that the tables below will often signify both good and bad things coming to you. The same things will similarly affect you in a harsh or tranquil manner. With a well-prepared soul, in accordance with your singular prudence, you will need to come forth strong and full of spirit against adverse and difficult things. Conversely, you will restrain swollen sails under a prosperous wind when good fortune blows." End of quote. And fortune thus allowed astrologers, or the concept of fortune, allowed astrologers like Heingarter to carry over into the realm of everyday regularities, expectations, self-conduct, the abstract outer horizon, God, the stars of cosmic government. In his personalized rules of astrological election, Heingarter counseled Jean de la Goutte on the avoidance of highly specific and therefore rarer celestial occurrences, or on the need for astrological knowledge in navigating grave or arduous affairs. Now, if, as Heingarter wrote to de la Goutte, the course of the celestial stars, the dispenser of our entire life, will guide the steering oar, then what did it mean to engage in self-government vis-à-vis the cosmos? First, of course, the negotiation of bodily fortune. A key reference for Heingarter was aphorism 5 of Pseudo-Ptolemy's Centiloquium, which, in the Plato of Tivoli translation that Heingarter used, reads, "The best astrologer can prohibit much evil to come forth by the stars, if he foreknows their natures. For he who is to suffer this evil will fortify himself so as to endure it." Notice how this aphorism casts astrological self-government as a matter of enduring, pati, in the Latin translation, misfortunes, by fortifying, praemunire, oneself against them. This was also Heingarter's own line when he recommended the following response. Clearly, we cannot simply impede the celestial operations and influences as such. Nevertheless, we can dispose the recipient in such a manner that when this celestial virtue comes, it will find the former ill-disposed for itself. Heingarter unpacks this further in other passages. For instance, elsewhere he writes that astrological knowledge allows future evils to be reduced to temperance or to hurt a person less because of its disagreement with the recipient body. Sorry, this is a bit too fast. Yep, here we are. Still elsewhere, what will we not attain some honor or favor when we foreknow that through celestial influxes these things will be easily attained and strengthened more conveniently and fruitfully, if we suitably dispose ourselves beforehand, as does the ruler for ruling, the buyer for buying, the sower for sowing, etc., so that when the celestial influx comes forth, and these are my italics, with natural powers prepared for a congruous disposition through prudence and foreknowledge, it would better flow into predisposed matter and would potently increase a future good. What is interesting in these passages, to me at least, I'm only speaking for myself, is that Heingarter is pretty clear that human agency revolves around altering the effects, not the fact, obviously, of celestial influence. Even more interestingly, astrological self-government seems to revolve around practices of what I might call appropriating celestial influence from within, as it were. This, to me, seems to be the red thread connecting these interesting passages. Astrological practice sought to govern bodily fortune, but also fortune of the soul. How exactly was astrology a form of care of the soul in Heingarter's works? Three different answers emerge, as far as I can tell. First of all, astrological knowledge of the soul's affects was the basis of securing bodily health, as suggested by the standard medical doctrine of the six non-naturals. Second of all, astrological monitoring of corporeal health was valued as a necessary precondition for the practice of princely virtues of the soul. In the dedication of his astrological regimen for Jean II of Bourbon, Heingarter wrote, "I will give you longevity through uncorrupted and firm health, so you would be able to exercise the most noble virtues of your rule, destined to the conservation of this reign for the longest time. For in you are to be found all virtues worthy of a supreme prince, fortitude, justice, severity, gravity, magnanimity, largesse," sorry, I didn't translate that, beneficence and liberality. Which prince of our age is more preeminent than you in nobility or briskness, constancy, greatness of soul, or indeed any kind of praise? The third mode in which astrology could cater for the health of the soul is that astral bodily passions were occasionally styled by Heingarter as directly shaping virtuous dispositions of the soul. Heingarter thus presented bodily immoderation as a stimulus of vice, advising de la Goutte to, I quote, "embrace the golden mean, which leads to the end of all goods, justice and temperance." And even the Duke himself, whom Mars saddled with a choleric temperament, was warned about the capacity of one astral accident of the soul, anger, to, I quote, "confound every act of reason, which would make John II do things you will regret." This firmly moved astrological practice onto terrain traditionally occupied by virtue ethics or the medieval culture of princely mirrors. But in what sense could astrological practice also be regarded as an ethical practice? One clue is offered in the annual prognostication for 1476, which Heingarter authored for King Louis XI. There, Heingarter first began, and he will do this throughout his subsequent writings, first began to rely on Duns Scotus' theory of the human will to conceptualize the relation of the human soul to the stars. This is Heingarter, the first time in the extant documentation, at least, that he goes with Duns Scotus in deepening his conception of the human will. A double affect is found in the rational soul, one for personal advantage, affectio commode, and one for justice, affectio justitiae. The one called affect for justice is the first moderator of the affect for personal advantage, because it is not suitable for it to pursue that to which the affect for personal advantage inclines, in as far as this affect for justice is an innate freedom of the will. As such, it can refrain itself in choosing an action, so the affect would not be followed. And beyond that affect for personal advantage, the will is also born to delight in the sensitive appetite. And this is why Aristotle says that the qualities of the soul follow the complexions of the body. And from this follows the solution of our question. The astrologer can judge more securely than physicians and natural philosophers the inclinations of the soul, not its acts, if he is experienced. End of quote. Heingarter II, addressing King Louis XI. In themselves, such statements are hardly remarkable. They offer a variation on the astrologer's creed that the stars incline but do not necessitate. Nevertheless, Heingarter's take on this topos, by way of Duns Scotus' Sententiae, is the basis of a few interesting developments, I think. First of all, Heingarter is emphatic that astrological knowledge not only serves to have human action governed by rational rather than sensitive appetites. Astrology's ability to capture the inclinations of the rational soul also opens a road to true human freedom. Second, more importantly, I think, notice how Heingarter's ethical interests focus on the formality, so to speak, rather than the content of princely action. It's almost as if governing celestially induced passions and appetites is its own reward, in as far as it liberates and disposes towards an affect for justice. And third, Heingarter is also explicit in connecting this to moral philosophy. The Tetrabiblos commentary, which he presented to Duke Jean II in 1477, retained a passage from Ibn Ridwan's commentary to Tetrabiblos 1.2, which stated that, and this is from Heingarter's version, when this art teaches us about future mores through knowledge of bodily spirits, since the latter follow bodily complexion, we can direct and amend these before any malice manifests itself, according to the methods which moral philosophers determined. My italics. Heingarter thus presented astrological knowledge as the basis of a broader practice which appropriated celestial influence in such a way that it shaped both bodily health and virtuous dispositions of the soul, and seems to have on occasion associated this with ethical practice. Alongside individual human bodies, late medieval astrology also posited social bodies as subjects of celestial influence. Indeed, one of the major innovations in 15th century European astrology concerns the sudden proliferation of a new genre of astrological prediction, the annual prognostication. Unfortunately, we only know the aforementioned manuscript prognostication for King Louis XI to have been composed by Heingarter, so in tracking down my question, my issue via Heingarter for the annual prognostication, Heingarter is not the best resource. For a more detailed understanding of the intended use of prognostications in this milieu, the next best thing may be had at the court of Louis de Bourbon, Duke Jean II's younger brother and Prince Bishop of Liège since 1456. Who was the dedicatee of several print prognostications by the Flemish astrologer Johannes Laat. As was usual in late medieval astrology, Laat's prognostications systematically sought to unveil, this is the language that is typically used, the dispositions and passions, sometimes also inclinations, but less so, of a wide variety of sublunary bodies. Laat's predictions on bodily health in these annual prognostications were geared to serve as prophylactic advice, but one sometimes also has the impression that one cannot underestimate the extent to which the annual prognostications were geared to manage the upstream affects of hope and fear, for instance. This is something that would need to be researched further, but I give it as something to be considered. Also consider Laat's extensive predictions for the body politic, i.e. the dispositions of rulers, the common people, ecclesiastical prelates, and men of war. It's easy to read these straightforwardly political predictions as self-advertisement or as princely propaganda, as has often been done. However, I think these interpretations run up against the double difficulty that, first of all, these predictions are often highly general, non-specific. Second of all, more importantly perhaps, they very often have a repertoire that is advisory rather than informative. In view of this, I would like to suggest that it may make sense to approach these predictions as exhortations to the cultivation of the practical virtue of prudence as such. Consider, for instance, Laat's prognostication for 1476. Taking his cue from the horoscope of a Saturn-Mars conjunction in Leo on the 20th of September 1475, Laat detected ample celestial inducements towards treason and deceit, even during peace negotiations. So that, I quote, captains of princes and lords should conduct themselves shrewdly, protect themselves well and wisely from this, and should not believe every spirit. End of quote. Notice how the pursuit of prudence is cast as an ethical issue of self-government to the point where Laat associates it with a theological project of the discernment of spirits. True to the classic epithet sapiens dominabitur astris, the prognostication served as an exhortative memorandum of the web of hidden influxes and spirits into which men were born, and inside of which reason was enjoined to painstakingly carve out a different path. The ethical valuation of the pursuit of prudence is even clearer in the dedication of the 1479 prognostication to Louis de Bourbon, where Lat writes, "With God as our witness, this prognostication is written for no other purpose than to have men's hearts convert to the good, and so men could take thorough precaution against menacing future evils. For instance, when the stars threaten us with future evils on earth, we, forewarned, would implore God with devout minds so that he, from his infinite goodness, would will to change the bad stellar influences that we fear into good. For God's will and human prudence alter and lift the influences of the stars on earth, as Ptolemy confirms when he says, etc." Here, the transformative nature of human prudence is not separate from the agency of God's will in negotiating the stars. Indeed, throughout Lat's prognostication runs the message that such negotiation involves the twin virtues of prudence and piety towards God. A message, I think, that cannot be solely interpreted as a disingenuous means to placate suspicious theologians, and which is, anyway, hardly uncommon among late 15th century prognosticators. Similarly, Lat's 1481 prognostic for the inhabitants of the Brabant town of Mechelen, it identified them as disposed towards, I quote, "many good and virtuous works," end of quote, but he made the realization of such virtuous dispositions contingent on the reader's earnest consideration of these celestial possibilities, as well as on, I quote, "the inclination of one's own spirit," end of quote. It's time for me to conclude. What was an astrological practice? In this talk, I've tried to show that, or suggest, for what it's worth, that from Bonati and Aquinas over Heingarter and Lat to Belante, late medieval astrologers' answers to this question pointed far beyond the magic circle of horoscope casting and interpretive technique. The astrological productions of Heingarter and Lat offered far more than mere predictions. Not unlike prophecy, astrology uncovered narratives of cosmic government and sought to institute practices of self-government. Accordingly, astrological discourse frequently included advice instructing readers on how to integrate predictions into their own lives. It's this kind of meta-advice, this kind of meta-narrative, I suppose, that I've tried to discuss for a specific time and place. In the late Middle Ages, astrological self-government revolved around the judicious appropriation of astral influx. Bodies were stabilized by a prophylactic fortifying of one's complexion. Fortunes were improved by diminishing the effects of unfortunate influxes and by shaping propitious conditions for the incarnation of good ones. Souls were exhorted through vivid predictions compiled from authoritative textbooks to embrace the pursuit of virtue and faith in God. And in all this, there was more than a little overlap with the late medieval literature of princely mirrors. Just as the latter increasingly focused on princely authority as the incarnation of specific virtues, justice, later prudence, so did astrological advice. Just as the latter operated through hortatory exempla and vivid analogies, so were the collages of annual prognostications, perhaps, primarily intended as exhortatory exempla of what might happen in the absence of prudence and faith. To this extent, I would like to suggest that astrological practice was understood as a form of practice and as inherently ethical and political. One last slide, if you'll indulge me. Why would it matter to approach astrology in this manner? For my own part, I would probably suggest very briefly at least two historiographic advantages. One advantage is that it connects up with broader movements in the history of science that have been with us since the mid-80s. I hope the book on the left-hand side is familiar to you, in which the authors, perhaps for the first time, made the argument that our habitual distinction between epistemic and political practices may be erroneous. It is in Leviathan and the Air Pump, famously, that the authors try to demonstrate that epistemic practices inevitably have material, literary, and social dimensions, and God knows how many historians of science have followed suit since. including the historian of astrology, whose most famous book you see on the right-hand side, Patrick Curry, but who decided to leave the profession because, as far as I can tell, he became disillusioned by what he seems to have experienced as a certain political naivete on the part of historians of astrology. That's one possible reason why what I've said might be of interest. Another reason is, second reason, is that it makes it much easier, I hope, to accommodate astrological practice in a shared historical narrative of changing societal frames of reference, especially when such narratives are typically constructed around the notion of a modernity that decrees astrology's very undoing. Instead of approaching astrology as a belief and or a technique, increasingly marginalized under the pressure of philosophical, religious, and political modernities, focusing on practices of self-government makes it possible to trace a more complex story, I think, of astrological practice as the site where such changing frames of reference are constantly reshaped and renegotiated. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Yes, I was very impressed by your talk, and I think I'm totally agree with most part. Just a point about Ptolemy and the pseudo-Ptolemy. You have quoted the fifth verbum of the Santeloquium, but the eighth one is Anima sapiens ita adjuvat opus stellarum quemad modum seminator fortitudines naturales. So it's also the power of soul, who is the power of the astrologer. I think that in the sentence, the famous sentence, vir sapiens dominabitur astris, which is sometimes, I would say frequently, anima sapiens dominabitur astris, there is also a notion of self-government, which is exactly in your direction.
Yes, and it is true that if I remember well, it's been a while since I thoroughly. I mean, this is based on I'm sorry. So I think it is in the extensive introduction that Heingarter wrote for the Jean de la Goutte regimen that he uses two references from Pseudo-Ptolemy, Aphorism 5 and Aphorism 8. Those two are his main. I mean, like most astrologers in this period, like these are the classics that you invoke. But if you look at the way that they deal with these, like it's very interesting to compare, I don't know, the Ibn Ridwan commentary, for instance, or Heingarter's use with Lorenzo Bonincontri, for instance, or Pontano. They all treat these references in slightly different ways, which I find are terribly interesting. But anyway, that's another story. But thank you for your remark. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Does Bonati speak about free will?
I'm hesitant to.
I'm hesitant.
I'm hesitant.
Because
yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I need to check. I don't know. I don't know.
You have to check, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. It was fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I have so much to think about now. But I just wanted to make one very small point. We were talking about Heingarter's a quote which ends with will guide the steering, or referring to fortune.
Yeah.
Yeah, that reminded me actually of well, in the period in late antiquity where I discussed the daimon in my book.
Right.
And of course, you can't really separate daimon from fortune in that time frame. So you know that struck me a lot. But Proclus has a remark about the daimon guiding our whole life, and he uses the word kybernetes, you know, which is another word for govern, right? And so I thought, really, what Heingarter is saying is something very similar to that.
No, yeah, I would probably go along. I mean, I'm interested in tracing these long-term continuities,
I can
right?
give you the exact quote.
But also the way in which they constantly adapt to these, like
Exactly.
this story cannot be disconnected from the very specific time frame that is the 15th century, and how these political frames of reference are manifesting themselves.
But I find it fascinating that you have these same ideas coming up again and again and again.
Yeah.
And really
redeployed.
In total application to astrological practice. And so, you know, that just struck me. I can give you the exact quotation, but as we also know, Proclus was a huge fan of astrology as well.
No, but I mean, your book is obviously a reference that I need to digest more thoroughly, and I think what you said about fortune is very important. Because on the one hand, you have these classic references in the history of late medieval and early modern political thought, Pocock, for instance, who really point towards fortune as a very as a key concept in these political changes.
Yes.
But on the other hand, this doesn't come out of nowhere, obviously. So it's a redeployment, which
And also the connection between body and soul. Fortune seen as body and diamond seen as soul. I mean, in the period that you're talking about, no one's going to be talking about the diamond.
No. Well, I wouldn't expect them to.
But it's
Indeed.
possibly being transferred to God.
Yeah, and reconceptualize, as I tried to show via Aquinas, for instance, into being reoperative, as it were, in a specific theological setting.
Yeah.
Anyway, those kinds of things.
Yes, and I think that was quite brilliant of you to make those connections. Yeah, it was wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. For one, I believe that probably in Treatise 5 of Bonati, there are some remarks about free will and the considerations. So maybe at the beginning. Okay. But can we go back to your slide where this fortification was mentioned? So fortify. Was that around the beginning?
Was it in the beginning?
Yeah.
Actually,
I just go and I will stop you, I think.
Yes, do stop me.
Okay. All right.
No.
No, I think.
No, it must be down now.
Yeah. So somewhere in. Yes.
No, not more. Here.
Oh no, the next one maybe.
No. Probably one of these. Here we are. Top one? Is it the top one?
Yes.
Or I have these on offer.
All right. Yes, that's it. Governing body. Yes, this is the one. In the first quote, there is this astrological knowledge allows future evils to be reduced to temperance or to hurt the person less because of a disagreement with the recipient body. What do you think this disagreement with the recipient body means? So is it a sort of a magic operation like preparation of the body in some ways, or it is just that the native has a sort of astrologically determined complexity that is adversarial to the actual influxes?
Yeah. So in the case of Heingarter, medicine is probably the way to think about this. But not just medicine. I would also suggest, basic Aristotelian natural philosophy. So the way I interpret it, I'm not saying I'm right, but is that he thinks of astrological dispositions as potentiae. So what you do basically is to work on these potentiae before they are actualized, as it were, right? Which is where the time difference plays the essential role. So basically, it's a matter of body work. Some body historians use this term. I find it somewhat attractive, actually. So what you do is actually, you do play with the temperamental. Well, not with the temperament, but you do play with the qualitative, you do qualitative fine-tuning of your body on the level of the potentiae before the influence actualizes itself. I think this is the direction in which we need to think about this.
This is really interesting because what Ptolemy says, and of course these writers are heavily influenced by Ptolemy, is that the preparation is viable only by foreknowledge. So Ptolemy doesn't write anything about some sort of bodily regimens. And I just wonder if, let's say, is this sort of a more church-compatible way of averting adverse influences than customary magic operations?
All I can say is that this would make sense to contemporaries, right? But if it is, if it's more or less, I'm a bit hesitant there. But it makes sense. I would say to
just because
to interpret it that way for that specific time and place. I mean,
because if it would be in this case, it would be a sort of a viable alternative to magical operations and still having the same potential of averting the evils.
Yes, I suppose. I don't think Heingarter got away with pushing it that far, but and I don't see any. I mean, Heingarter is a really good source for medical astrology as well, and his primary occupation was that of a physician to the Duke. This much is clear. He doesn't violate our standard pictures of the relationships between astrology and medicine, as far as I can tell. Only he's far more willing to deploy medical discourse in articulating astrology than some of the other people I've read from this period. This is probably as far as I'd go right now.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Stephen. When you have the slide right here, I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more about. Do you think this is really points to the direction to lower the limits between magic and prognostication, so that this brings magic closer to prognostic practices, or is? In the moment when you start saying that astrological knowledge reduces something, it does something besides of prognostication.
Oh, well, it allows you, if you know what's coming, then you can sorry, yes, of course. I'm used to walking. So if astrological knowledge allows you to make a qualitative assessment of what kind of body needs to be fashioned, as it were.
So there's still a difference to, let's say, making an amulet?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
It's a huge question because the literature on amulets, which I don't know very well, but it often has strong positions on agency, on technology, and I'm not always convinced. So it's something that I still need to elaborate myself. You know, some of the literature on astrological amulets, for instance, makes the connection, portrays them as a kind of limiting case for the general case of astrological elections. So again, it's a much broader issue. What happens in an astrological election? To come back to your talk yesterday, right? What kind of it's not always clear to me what kind of senses of agency are implied. What do you do when you do an election? That was what the Bonati quote that I started about was about. Bonati says, astrological elections do not make something. What they do is allow you to engage in the recipient, to prepare the recipient for things that are flowing down. This is actually the language that Pontano will use when he speaks about elections in the second half of the 15th century. You allow influences to flow down more steeply as from an embankment. I think this is how Pontano talks about it. It's wonderful language. So this is how they think about election. But what kind of theory of history, what kind of theory of agency do you have? All of that is unclear as far as I'm concerned. Sorry, I'm a bit, but yeah.
I think this is.
So this is a very expensive way of saying I don't know. But yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, I think what you elaborate, it makes clear that there is it's a different view on it. It does not seem to be magic in that.
But I don't know if words like magic are helpful in this case.
I don't know either.
I don't. Yeah, I'm not even sure of that really. So I'm going with government for a while, and if maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. We'll see. Yeah.
It's definitely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to make a small comment for something you said at the beginning regarding the 18th and 19th century, which is not engaged by historians of science. And I think the main reason is that by that time, astrology is no longer part of the sciences. So history of science will not engage it unless as a pseudoscience, as a history of
But that's not what the historians of science have been telling us that they do.
No.
No, there's something weird going on there.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that astrology is removed from science. It collapses. It's marginalized. That marginalization process occurs.
Okay.
So it's no longer science.
So as historians of science, we say we do one thing, but we do another.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it has to be the historians of culture.
So then the question becomes, why do we do that? As far as I'm concerned. Anyway.
But it's a problem. It's a problem. I've come across it sometimes. Yeah. Okay.
Because I thought about the same question, but when you are looking on history astronomy, there's a focus until the early modern times, and then it fades down too. So it's probably not only the contents of astrology, but also the how do you say in English, leading sciences change.
Yeah. No, there's not a single explanation. I'm sure there's also the contingencies of the research community. Absolutely, but I'm not sure that's the entire explanation. Anyway. Yeah. Well, the politics of the discipline, I suppose. But anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.